Act as if the waiting period is over, not because time has suddenly agreed with you, not because circumstances have sent you a letter of approval, but because within you the decision has already been made. Waiting is not a season imposed upon you by life, it is a habit of consciousness. The moment you change the inner posture from anticipation to acceptance, the weight dissolves. You are not here to beg tomorrow for permission to feel complete today. You are here to occupy the state that already contains the fulfillment. And from that occupation, the visible world must rearrange itself. Most people believe waiting is noble. They think patience is the proof of wisdom. But there is a difference between patience and postponement of self. Patience is calm assurance. Waiting is silent doubt dressed up as virtue. When you say it will happen one day, you quietly confess that it has not happened now. Consciousness hears you precisely. Life responds not to what you want, but to what you are being. If you are being the one who waits, life will faithfully supply more reasons to wait. You were never meant to stand at the door of desire, checking the clock. You were meant to walk through the door and sit down as if the house has always been yours. Acting as if the waiting period is over is not pretending, it is aligning. It is choosing the inner stance that says, "This is done," and allowing the echo of that stance to ripple outward. Reality is not moved by effort, but by assumption. What you assume to be true begins to harden into fact. Ask yourself honestly how you would think if the thing you desire were already secured. Not how you would celebrate, not how you would announce it, but how you would breathe. How would your inner dialogue soften? What urgency would fall away? There is a quietness that comes with fulfillment, a simplicity. Acting as if the waiting period is over means entering that quietness now. It means letting go of the inner arguments, the rehearsed explanations, the constant scanning for signs. Fulfillment is not loud, it is settled. Many struggle because they are addicted to the middle. The middle feels important, it feels like progress, it feels like doing something. But the middle is a loop. You review, you affirm, you analyze, you hope, you doubt, and you repeat. Acting as if the wait is over ends the loop. You no longer stand between desire and fulfillment. You collapse the distance by assumption. You do not cross the bridge, you awaken to the fact that you were already on the other side. There is nothing mystical about this, it is psychological law. The world you see is the delayed mirror of the world you consent to within. If you keep consenting to not yet, the mirror faithfully reflects delay. When you consent to now, the mirror begins to rearrange. Not instantly, perhaps, but inevitably. Time is not the obstacle, resistance is. Waiting is resistance disguised as hope. You may ask, but what about facts? Facts are simply the footprints of past assumptions. They have no authority over the present moment unless you grant it. Acting as if the waiting period is over does not mean denying facts. It means refusing to bow to them. You acknowledge what is visible without letting it define what is real. Reality is born in consciousness first, then expressed as circumstance. To reverse this order is to remain trapped in reaction. Think of how naturally you act when you know something is settled. When a bill is paid, you do not check the account every hour. When a decision is final, you do not argue with yourself. That same naturalness is the signature of fulfilled assumption. You do not strain to feel it, you simply stop straining. Acting as if the waiting period is over is a release, not a performance. The mind resists this simplicity because it has been trained to equate effort with worthiness. You feel you must earn fulfillment through suffering, time, or repetition. But consciousness does not operate on merit, it operates on identification. What you identify as yourself, you experience. If you identify as the one who is becoming, you remain becoming. If you identify as the one who is, you begin to be. Notice how often you postpone joy. You say, when this happens, then I'll relax. But relaxation is not the reward, it is the cause. The relaxed assumption of fulfillment is what allows the outer form to appear. Tension is the signal of absence. Ease is the signal of presence. Acting as if the waiting period is over is choosing ease now, without permission from the world. This does not mean you become passive. It means your actions change quality. They no longer come from desperation, but from alignment. When you act from waiting, every step feels heavy, conditional, anxious. When you act from fulfillment, actions are lighter, fewer, and more precise. You do not chase opportunities, you recognize them. You do not force conversations, they arise naturally. The world begins to cooperate because you are no longer fighting it internally. You may fear disappointment if you assume too boldly. But disappointment comes from expectation without identification. Acting as if the waiting period is over is not expecting, it is accepting. Expectation looks forward, acceptance rests now. There is nothing fragile about acceptance. It does not break if the world lags behind. It simply remains, knowing the lag is temporary. Observe how children play. When they assume a role, they become it fully. They do not check reality for confirmation. They do not wait for permission. They enter the state and let the game unfold. That same imaginative immersion is the creative power you never lost, only disciplined into caution. Acting as if the waiting period is over is returning to that natural authority over inner states. You do not need to visualize endlessly. A single clear acceptance is worth more than hours of strained imagery. Feel the difference between wanting and having. Wanting leans forward, having sits back. Wanting asks questions, having answers none. Wanting watches the calendar, having forgets it. Choose the posture of having, even if only for moments at first. Those moments accumulate. They teach consciousness a new normal. The world cannot deny a normal. Whatever becomes normal to you seeks expression. If struggle is normal, struggle repeats. If ease is normal, ease organizes itself around you. Acting as if the waiting period is over is making fulfillment normal internally before it becomes common externally. This is not arrogance, it is alignment with law. Let go of the idea that you must convince yourself. You do not convince, you consent. You simply stop arguing for absence. When a thought arises that says it's not here yet, you do not fight it. You let it pass, returning gently to the settled feeling of completion. Power is not in force, it is in persistence of state. You might notice discomfort when you first stop waiting. The mind will protest. It will say you are being unrealistic, careless, irresponsible. This is just the old identity dissolving. Waiting had a role, it gave you a sense of movement. But movement without arrival is exhaustion. Allow the discomfort. It is the sound of a habit breaking. Act as if the waiting period is over in small, intimate ways. How would you speak to yourself if the desire were fulfilled? How would you plan your day? What would you stop explaining to others? Begin there. You do not need to announce anything. Fulfillment is quiet. It does not seek witnesses. It simply is. Notice how much energy you spend monitoring progress. Progress is irrelevant once arrival is assumed. The seed does not dig itself up to check roots. Acting as if the waiting period is over is planting and walking away. Trust is not blind faith. It is refusal to interfere. When doubt appears, see it as a memory of waiting, not a prophecy. You do not have to obey every thought. Thoughts are echoes of former states. States change first, thoughts follow. Stay with the state. Let the echoes fade. Life responds fastest when you stop asking it to hurry. Urgency tells life you believe in delay. Calm tells life you believe in order. Acting as if the waiting period is over is choosing calm. It is saying, I know how this ends, so I do not rush the middle. There is a subtle joy that comes from this stance. Not excitement, not relief, but a steady contentment. This joy is not dependent on evidence. It is the joy of alignment. From it, creativity flows. Ideas arrive unforced, connections form naturally. You become magnetic not because you try, but because you are no longer reaching. You may still take action, but action will feel like expression, not effort. You move because it feels natural to move, not because you are trying to make something happen. The difference is profound. One creates resistance, the other allows inevitability. Act as if the waiting period is over even when nothing seems to change, especially then. The moment you decide that inner peace is not conditional, you step out of the cycle. The outer world always catches up. It has no choice. It is an effect, not a cause. Do not measure success by speed, measure it by stability of state. If you can rest in fulfillment for longer periods, you are succeeding. The outer reflection will arrive at its appointed moment, shaped by the clarity of your assumption. You are not here to manage the how. The how belongs to a deeper intelligence that responds to states, not strategies. When you stop waiting, you stop interfering. You hand the details over by no longer gripping them mentally. Act as if the waiting period is over by trusting your inner decision more than outer delay. Delay is not denial. It is simply the time it takes for a new assumption to displace an old one in the visible field. Stay faithful to the new. Let the old stories fall away. You are not someone who almost has it, who is close, who is PR, erring. You are the one who has entered. Speak from that place inwardly. Think from that place. Rest there. The greatest freedom is realizing you do not need permission to be fulfilled. Fulfillment is a state, not an event. Events are its shadows. Choose the substance and let the shadow follow. Act as if the waiting period is over now, not tomorrow, not after one more sign. Now, because now is the only moment where states are chosen. When you do, you will notice something simple and profound. Life begins to meet you where you are, instead of keeping you where you were. When you remain in this attitude, something subtle shifts in how you relate to effort. You stop trying to prove your faith through repetition and begin living it through quiet certainty. The inner voice no longer asks, "Is this working?" Because that question belongs to someone still standing outside the door. Acting as if the waiting period is over means you no longer check the lock. You assume entry, and assumption is the highest form of confidence. You will notice that your reactions change before circumstances do. Situations that once triggered anxiety now feel neutral, even irrelevant. This is not indifference, it is freedom. When fulfillment is assumed, external events lose their power to define your mood. You do not rise and fall with appearances. You remain centered, knowing appearances are temporary arrangements responding to a deeper command. There is a temptation to return to waiting when the world tests your resolve. Old patterns may reappear, not to defeat you, but to see if you will identify with them again. Acting as if the waiting period is over means you refuse to re-enter the old role. You observe without attachment. You let the wave pass without calling it your reality. The mind may say, be realistic, but realism is merely loyalty to the past. Acting as if the waiting period is over is loyalty to the unseen, and the unseen is always the source. Every visible thing was once invisible. To trust only what you can see is to arrive late to your own life. As this state becomes familiar, you stop narrating your journey. You no longer need to explain where you are or where you're going. Explanation belongs to uncertainty. Certainty is silent. You begin to live more privately within yourself, even while appearing active in the world. This inner privacy is power. You may find that some desires lose their urgency. This does not mean you no longer want them. It means you no longer cling to them. Clinging is the language of waiting. Allowing is the language of having. Acting as if the waiting period is over naturally transforms desire into expectation without tension. Notice how time feels different when you are no longer waiting. Days feel fuller, not because more happens, but because you are no longer mentally elsewhere. Waiting pulls you into the future. Fulfillment anchors you in the present. And the present is where creation actually occurs. There is a deep intelligence within you that responds immediately to identity. When you say inwardly, "This is who I am now," that intelligence reorganizes perception, choice, and opportunity to match. You do not see new doors because they appear because you can now see them. If impatience arises, do not condemn it. Simply recognize it as the residue of an old state. Return gently to the feeling of completion. You are not correcting a mistake. You are remembering a decision. Acting as if the waiting period is over is less about discipline and more about remembrance. You begin to understand that fulfillment does not arrive to change you, it arrives because you changed. The world does not transform you into the fulfilled version of yourself. You transform, and the world follows. This Rev, everything you were taught about cause and effect. In this state, even obstacles appear differently. They no longer feel like blocks, but like rearrangements. You do not label them as problems. You assume they are part of the movement toward what is already settled. Meaning changes when identity changes. The urge to seek reassurance fades. You stop asking others for confirmation because confirmation is internal. Acting as if the waiting period is over means you trust your inner knowing more than collective opinion. You respect experience, but you do not worship consensus. There is also a refinement of desire that takes place. You no longer want from lack, you want from clarity. Some things fall away naturally because they belong to an older version of you. This is not loss, it is alignment correcting itself. You may notice moments of stillness where nothing feels necessary. These moments are not emptiness, they are saturation. You are full. From fullness, action arises effortlessly. From emptiness, action is forced. Acting as if the waiting period is over keeps you rooted in fullness. Gradually, you stop measuring your life by milestones and begin measuring it by inner coherence. How aligned do you feel with yourself? How natural does your experience feel? These become your indicators, not external markers. The more you stay in this assumption, the more natural it feels to expect cooperation from life, not because life owes you, but because cooperation is the default response to inner order. Resistance only appears when there is internal contradiction. You will also find that gratitude deepens without being forced. Not gratitude for things happening, but gratitude for being. This gratitude is not a technique, it is a byproduct of fulfillment assumed. It arises spontaneously when you are no longer waiting to feel whole. As you continue, the line between imagination and reality becomes less rigid. You understand that imagination is not escape, but instruction. What you consistently accept inwardly instructs the world how to respond. Acting as if the waiting period is over is giving clear instruction instead of mixed signals. There may be moments when nothing seems to move at all. In those moments, remain unmoved. Stillness does not mean stagnation. Often the deepest rearrangements happen beyond observation. Trust does not demand updates. You realize then that the greatest shift was never outside. It was the moment you stopped identifying as someone in transit and allowed yourself to be someone arrived. From that point onward, every experience takes on a different tone, shaped by the quiet authority of one who is no longer waiting. As this awareness settles more deeply, you begin to sense that effort itself was never the missing ingredient. The missing element was permission, permission you were unconsciously waiting to receive from circumstances. Acting as if the waiting period is over is the moment you grant that permission to yourself. You no longer postpone identity. You step into it without ceremony. You may notice that when challenges arise, they do not pull you out of yourself the way they once did. They pass through your experience like weather rather than becoming the climate of your life. Waiting turns every challenge into a verdict. Fulfillment turns challenges into temporary conditions, incapable of defining who you are. There is a subtle dignity that comes with this state. You stop bargaining with life. You stop negotiating your worth through outcomes. You simply stand where you have decided to stand. This dignity is not arrogance, it is inner stability. It comes from no longer leaning on external validation to feel grounded. Your inner conversations change in tone. They become fewer, softer, more factual. You stop rehearsing arguments and explanations that were meant for a future that never needed convincing. Acting as if the waiting period is over simplifies the mind. Simplicity is a sign of alignment. When you no longer wait, comparison loses its grip. Other people's timelines stop disturbing you. You recognize that comparison is a form of waiting because it places your fulfillment in relation to another's progress. Fulfillment assumed has no rivals. It is personal, complete, and self-sufficient. You may feel drawn to different choices, different environments, even different rhythms of living. This is not restlessness, it is resonance adjusting. When identity changes, preferences follow. Acting as if the waiting period is over allows these shifts without guilt or explanation. There is also a new relationship with uncertainty. Instead of fearing it, you allow it. Uncertainty becomes a space where unseen movement is taking place, not a sign that something is wrong. Waiting interprets uncertainty as lack. Fulfillment interprets it as transition. At times, you may catch yourself almost wanting to wait again, because waiting gave you something to hold on to. It gave structure to longing, but fulfillment gives structure to being. It requires less mental activity, and the mind may resist that quiet. Let it settle. Quiet is not emptiness, it is clarity. As you remain faithful to this inner stance, you begin to experience a form of trust that is not emotional. It is not excitement or hope, it is steadiness. This steadiness does not fluctuate with news, results, or opinions. It rests on identity rather than evidence. You become less reactive to delays because delays no longer threaten you. They cannot take away what you have already assumed. Acting as if the waiting period is over is understanding that time can only rearrange appearances, not remove states. Your attention naturally withdraws from monitoring outcomes and returns to presence. You engage more fully with what is in front of you, not as a distraction, but as an expression of wholeness. Life feels less like preparation and more like participation. You may notice that people respond to you differently, not because you are trying to influence them, but because inner certainty communicates itself silently. Others feel the absence of need, and need is often what repels. Fulfillment assumed is magnetic precisely because it asks for nothing. There is a refinement in how you imagine. You no longer imagine to escape your present, you imagine from a position of ownership. Images become confirmations rather than wishes. They feel calm, natural, and brief, like memories instead of fantasies. Even rest feels different. It is no longer recovery from strain, but enjoyment of balance. Waiting exhausts the nervous system, fulfillment soothes it. Acting as if the waiting period is over allows your body to align with your mind. You begin to understand that faith is not intensity, it is consistency of identity. You do not need to feel convinced every moment. You only need to return again and again to the assumption that defines you. This return becomes effortless over time. When doubt arises, you do not dramatize it. You see it as an old reflex looking for relevance. You do not argue with it, you outgrow it. Acting as if the waiting period is over naturally renders doubt obsolete. There is also a sense of timing that emerges. You no longer push or delay unnecessarily. Actions arise when they are ripe, not when you are anxious. This timing is not calculated, it is felt. It comes from alignment rather than strategy. Gradually, the concept of almost there disappears from your inner language. You stop seeing life as a sequence of thresholds. You recognize that the only real threshold was the decision to stop waiting. Once crossed, everything else unfolds as variation, not initiation. You remain open but not needy, interested but not attached, engaged but not dependent. These qualities are not practiced, they are the natural posture of someone who has ended the waiting internally and allowed life to catch up at its own pace. As this posture stabilizes, you begin to sense how much of your previous effort was aimed at managing emotion rather than creating experience. Waiting keeps emotion on a tight leash, constantly adjusting, correcting, suppressing, acting as if the waiting period is over, releases that management. Feelings are allowed to rise and fall without being interpreted as signs. They lose authority over direction. You no longer feel the need to label every inner shift as progress or failure. Measurement belongs to waiting. Fulfillment does not measure itself, it simply expresses. You begin to trust that what matters is already in motion, even when the surface appears unchanged. The urge to constantly prepare fades. Preparation assumes absence. You stop living as someone rehearsing for life and start living as someone already in it. This does not make you careless, it makes you present. Presence replaces strategy. Your sense of self becomes less negotiable. You do not abandon yourself to fit conditions. Conditions are seen as temporary expressions, not permanent definitions. Acting as if the waiting period is over means you remain loyal to your inner position even when appearances fluctuate. You may notice that silence becomes more comfortable. You do not rush to fill it with affirmations, plans, or explanations. Silence is no longer threatening because it is no longer empty. It is full of assumption quietly doing its work. There is also a softening toward yourself. Waiting is often harsh. It demands timelines, results, roof. Fulfillment is gentle. It allows you to be human without questioning your direction. You stop using discipline as punishment and begin to experience it as alignment. When decisions arise, they feel cleaner. You are not deciding from fear of missing out or fear of being wrong. You are deciding from resonance. Choices feel obvious rather than stressful. Acting as if the waiting period is over clarifies priorities without analysis. You begin to see how much imagination was previously used against you, imagining loss, delay, disappointment. Now imagination shifts roles. It becomes supportive, calm, factual. It confirms rather than contradicts. This is not forced optimism, it is coherence. Even when memories of past disappointment surface, they no longer dictate expectation. They are recognized as closed chapters, not predictive patterns. Waiting turns memory into prophecy. Fulfillment returns memory to its proper place. You also stop seeking signs in trivial details. Signs are unnecessary when certainty is present. You no longer read meaning into every coincidence. You allow life to speak plainly rather than through symbols you feel compelled to decode. At times you may feel almost bored, and this boredom can feel unfamiliar. Waiting was dramatic. Fulfillment is simple. Do not mistake simplicity for stagnation. Simplicity is the natural state of things that are resolved internally. Your relationship with desire continues to evolve. Desire no longer feels like hunger, it feels like direction. You want without urgency, you prefer without pressure. Acting as if the waiting period is over removes desperation from wanting and leaves clarity intact. You find that you can enjoy moments fully without thinking about what they lead to. Enjoyment without agenda is a clear sign that waiting has loosened its grip. The present is no longer a stepping stone, it is sufficy. There is an increasing sense that life is responding to you rather than testing you. Events feel less confrontational and more conversational. This does not mean everything is pleasant, but everything feels relevant rather than obstructive. You also notice a decrease in self-surveillance. You stop checking whether you are doing it right. That question belongs to someone trying to arrive. Acting as if the waiting period is over dissolves the need for constant self-correction. Gradually, trust becomes embodied rather than conceptual. It is felt in posture, breath, tone of thought. You carry yourself differently, not to impress, but because inner certainty naturally expresses itself through the body. You may still set goals, but they feel like extensions rather than solutions. Goals enhance experience instead of completing it. Waiting turns goals into lifelines, fulfillment turns them into preferences. As this continues, the idea of returning to waiting feels increasingly unnatural. You recognize it now as a state, not a necessity. And because it is a state, it can be exited again and again, each time more easily, as you remain anchored in the quiet understanding that what truly matters was settled the moment you stopped waiting inside. From this place, you begin to see how identity quietly instructs behavior without effort. You do not need reminders to act in alignment. Alignment becomes automatic. When the waiting period ends internally, actions lose their urgency and gain their accuracy. You move when movement is natural, not when anxiety demands it. Your relationship with control changes as well. Waiting often disguises itself as control, constant planning meant to prevent disappointment. Fulfillment loosens that grip. You realize control was never the source of safety, self-trust was. Acting as if the waiting period is over restores that trust without negotiation. You may notice that you respond rather than react. Reaction belongs to anticipation. Response belongs to presence. Situations no longer hijack your emotional state. You meet them from where you stand, instead of being pulled into where you fear they might lead. There is a subtle shift in how you interpret effort. Effort is no longer something you push, it is something that flows. When effort feels heavy, you recognize it as misalignment rather than necessity. Acting as if the waiting period is over teaches you to respect ease as guidance, not laziness. You stop overloading meaning onto setbacks. A delay is no longer a verdict on your worth or direction. It is simply movement unfolding in a way you cannot yet see. Waiting personalizes delay. Fulfillment contextualizes it. As this state matures, you find that your inner world becomes less crowded. There are fewer arguments, fewer rehearsals, fewer imagined futures. Mental space opens up. In that space, intuition speaks more clearly, without competition from fear. You also become less tempted to revisit the past for reassurance or explanation. The past loses its power to define you because identity is now rooted in the present assumption. Acting as if the waiting period is over frees you from constantly justifying where you are based on where you were. Even ambition takes on a different flavor. It is no longer driven by escape from lack, but by curiosity and expression. You pursue because you enjoy moving, not because you feel incomplete standing still. You may experience moments where nothing seems to be happening externally, yet internally everything feels settled. These moments are not pauses, they are confirmations. They indicate that the inner shift has stabilized enough that it no longer needs reinforcement. Your patience deepens, but it is no longer the patience of endurance. It is the patience of certainty. You are not tolerating the present while waiting for the future. You are inhabiting the present fully, knowing the future is already aligned with your state. You also notice that fear loses its urgency. It may still appear, but it no longer commands action. Acting as if the waiting period is over places fear in its proper role, as in formation, not instruction, is a natural generosity that arises from this fullness. You give without calculating return. You listen without preparing response. You engage without agenda. Waiting makes every interaction transactional. Fulfillment restores genuine connection. You begin to trust subtle impulses, a thought to reach out, a nudge to pause, an idea to explore. These impulses feel clean, unforced. They arise from alignment rather than lack. Acting as if the waiting period is over sharpens discernment. As you remain in this state, you become less impressed by dramatic change and more appreciative of quiet consistency. Stability becomes attractive. You recognize that lasting transformation often arrives without spectacle. You may also feel less urgency to explain your process to others. Words feel unnecessary. Your way of being communicates more clearly than any explanation could. Waiting seeks validation through speech. Fulfillment speaks through presence. Gradually, the sense of trying to become dissolves. You recognize that becoming was always an idea, not a requirement. Being was sufficient all along. Acting as if the waiting period is over allows you to rest in that being without resistance. From here, life does not feel like a question demanding an answer. It feels like a conversation already in motion, responding naturally to the tone you have chosen to speak from, a tone no longer shaped by waiting, but by quiet assurance that remains steady even as the outer scene continues to unfold. You start to recognize that many of your former habits were built around filling time rather than living it. Waiting made time feel heavy, something to be endured or escaped. Acting as if the waiting period is over changes your experience of time entirely. Moments feel lighter, less urgent, more complete in themselves. You are no longer rushing through no to arrive somewhere else. Your attention naturally shifts from outcomes to quality. You care less about how fast things appear and more about how true your inner state feels. This sincerity with yourself becomes the new compass. When something feels forced, you pause. When something feels aligned, you move. There is no drama in either choice. You may notice that resistance often appears when you momentarily forget who you are being. Resistance is not opposition from life, it is friction between states. When you return to the assumption that the waiting period is over, resistance softens without effort. Things begin to flow again, not because you fixed them, but because you stopped contradicting yourself internally. There is also a growing sense of self-containment. You no longer scatter your energy across multiple imagined futures. Your energy gathers naturally in the present. This concentration is not tense, it is calm and grounded. Acting as if the waiting period is over brings your power back from the future into now. You stop asking whether you deserve what you want. Deserving belongs to a system of reward and punishment that waiting thrives on. Fulfillment assumed bypasses that system entirely. You experience not because you earned, but because you accepted. Your inner language becomes more declarative and less conditional. You notice fewer ifs and whens in your thoughts. Statements feel settled, not argued. This shift may seem small, but it changes how consciousness organizes experience. You begin to sense that clarity does not always come before movement. Sometimes movement reveals clarity. Acting as if the waiting period is over allows you to move without needing complete understanding first. Understanding follows alignment, not the other way around. You also grow less attached to emotional highs. Waiting often chases excitement as proof that something is happening. Fulfillment does not need excitement to validate itself. It is content with steadiness. Emotional neutrality no longer feels like lack. It feels like balance. When uncertainty appears, it no longer pulls you into mental spirals. You allow it to exist without naming it as a problem. Uncertainty becomes a neutral space where unseen adjustments are occurring. Waiting tries to fill that space with worry. Fulfillment lets it remain open. You may notice that your body responds to this shift before your circumstances do. Breathing deepens, shoulders soften, sleep improves. These are not coincidences. The body responds immediately when the mind releases anticipation and settles into acceptance. Your sense of agency becomes quieter but stronger. You no longer feel the need to assert control loudly. Influence flows through consistency of state rather than force of will. Acting as if the waiting period is over aligns you with this quieter form of power. You become less interested in shortcuts and more interested in coherence. Anything that promises instant relief at the cost of inner contradiction loses its appeal. You prefer what feels true over what feels fast. As you continue, you notice that imagination no longer feels separate from daily life. It weaves naturally into perception. You imagine without effort, and what you imagine feels familiar rather than distant. This familiarity is a sign that the state has been accepted, not merely visited. You stop bracing for disappointment. Bracing is a form of waiting, a way of protecting identity by lowering expectation. Acting as if the waiting period is over removes the need for that armor. You meet experience openly, without rehearsing loss. Even when things unfold slowly, you no longer feel delayed. Delay only exists when fulfillment is projected into the future. When fulfillment is assumed now, movement. T is simply movement, not postponement. You begin to understand that certainty does not require constant reinforcement. It requires consistency. You return to the same inner position gently, repeatedly, without drama. Over time, this position feels more natural than waiting ever did. Life continues to present contrast, but contrast no longer confuses you. You do not interpret every difference as a problem to solve. Some contrasts are simply variety within alignment. Acting as if the waiting period is over allows you to hold that distinction without strain. Gradually, the question, is it coming, fades from relevance. Not because you forced it away, but because it no longer fits your inner posture. You are not someone expecting, you are someone allowing, and allowing does not need to ask what is already in motion. You begin to notice that the very idea of arrival starts to soften. Arrival was always a concept tied to waiting, a finish line imagined to justify the discomfort of the present. When the waiting period ends internally, arrival becomes less dramatic and more continuous. Life feels like a series of confirmations rather than a single moment of resolution. Your sense of identity becomes less dependent on circumstances proving anything. You no longer feel defined by what has or has not shown up yet. Acting as if the waiting period is over anchors you in a self-definition that does not fluctuate with results. From that steadiness, confidence grows without effort. You may observe that when challenges appear, you do not rush to interpret them. Interpretation was part of waiting, a way to determine whether you were getting closer or farther. Now you allow events to unfold without immediately assigning meaning. Meaning reveals itself naturally when you are not trying to extract it. There is also a shift in how you relate to imagination during quiet moments. You no longer use it to escape dissatisfaction. Instead, imagination feels like a gentle companion, confirming what you already know rather than compensating for what you think is missing. Images arise briefly, clearly, and then dissolve without attachment. You become less invested in maintaining emotional momentum. Waiting often required constant motivation, constant reassurance. Fulfillment assumed does not need to be energized. It is self-sustaining. You do not fall apart on low energy days because your identity is no longer tied to emotional intensity. You start trusting pauses. Pauses no longer feel like regression. They feel like integration. Acting as if the waiting period is over allows you to rest without guilt, knowing rest does not delay what is already aligned. Your perception of effort continues to refine. You recognize when effort is inspired and when it is compensatory. Inspired effort feels clean, almost effortless. compensatory effort feels heavy and urgent, you naturally choose the former more often without moralizing the difference. You also become more selective with where you place attention. Attention is no longer scattered across fears, timelines, and comparisons. It gathers around what feels alive and relevant now. This gathering increases clarity without forcing focus. You may notice that your inner world feels less crowded with future projections. The mental images of what if lose their charge, acting as if the waiting period is over, collapses many imagined futures into a single grounded present. When memories surface, they no longer pull you backward. You see them as references, not identities. Waiting clings to memory for explanation. Fulfillment acknowledges memory without living in it. There is a growing sense that life is not something you must unlock, it is something you participate in. Acting as if the waiting period is over shifts you from observer to participant without requiring certainty about every next step. You become more comfortable not knowing details. Details once felt necessary to reassure the waiting mind. Now you trust that knowing will arrive when relevance arrives. This trust is not passive, it is relaxed awareness.